Hi, hello everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here because I'm going to talk about one of the most relevant topics of our time, gender. I will be speaking in briefly about the history and evolution of gender studies, looking at its not focusing so much on the history and choosing, I would of course be choosing few examples from Malayalam and Kerala. Kerala പരിസരത്തുനിന്ന് തന്നെയാണ് എല്ലാ examples. Actually, I feel like an interloper because I'm not a historian and I'm from the literature stream with gender and language and gender and language and cultural discourses as my primary concerns. Which it would be my primary concern, language and cultural discourses, because they impact our daily lives and our social structures as well, both ways. Today's talk also will focus on that because that is my area. And first of all, I'd like to thank Manoj Mash for inviting me and also taking this risk because in fact, it's interesting that I had the good fortune to meet Manoj Mash and Lukman sir at a gender sensitization course, which was a wonderful gathering because that helped all of us to look into our own gender perceptions and prejudices. Let me also congratulate the department and the coordinator, Jafar Odekal, I haven't met him so far, for organizing this series of webinar talks. Today, like many of you probably, I was also watching US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking on being referred to by her fellow congressmen as a fucking bitch. And her outrage, she was expressing her outrage over the sexist culture which had sort of infiltrated into the highest echelons of US government. And it is all over social media. Like how a month back we were debating the sexist trolling of the teacher who taught the story of Tangupucha. In fact, our transition to online teaching began in a fitting manner because, it was sort of exposing the fault lines of our misogyny, which is deeply deeply rooted in Kerala's culture. And we, less than a week ago, we were again talking about tuna malsyam with reference to the gold smuggling case and Sapna. I think we have a fetish for that. We never seem to back away from tuna malsyam. Of course, we keep our standard because Menon nammal parayilla, nammal malsyam ne parayilla. Korchu dignity odu samsarikkollu, or Sanskritized type nammal samsarikkollu. And this is, of course, a good starting point because every day we are assailed by a culture of violence, sexism, and gender blindness, especially in Kerala, where there is a marked imbalance in gender relations and power relations as well, structured by gender. Our prejudices of what constitutes masculinity and femininity are deeply rooted in our misogyny, evident everywhere on a daily basis in media, in cultural discourses, our language, everything. Our language is a terribly gender partial language. And also in our recent encounters with LGBTQ community, the difficulties they had to face, etc. So the list of daily indignities that we face and we heap upon ourselves, they seem to be never ending because our skewered, faulty social constructs of gender and our gender realities, which are structured on patriarchal power, the indignities seem endless. No doubt about that. As we know, just to talk about a bit about a gender history as such, I'm not a historian, as I said earlier. Gender history is an outgrowth of women's history. Gender history is an outgrowth of women's history, which is a natural extension of women's studies, and which was triggered by second wave feminism. We started talking about gender history and gender studies, gender history in particular with second wave feminism. And gender history is a subfield of gender studies where gender and history coalesce, asking us to interrogate the past, and hence by interrogating the past, also looking at the present from the perspective of gender, which was not there earlier in traditional historiography. The history of gender looks at how androcentric cultures, that is man-centered culture, man-centric cultures, impacts women. I'll be explaining as we go because Sir said that we are pitching it primarily for the MA students. So present from the perspective of, we're looking at history from the perspective of gender, incorporating a gender perspective into history, and looking at the androcentric culture, male-centric culture, which how it has impacted women, and more specifically at historical events, personages, classifications, and periodizations which continue to affect women, and how differently from how it impacts women, how differently it impacts women from men who enjoy, of course, enjoy power and dominance in a patriarchal social structure. Like, say, for instance, it has triggered questions like, did women have a renaissance at all? John Kelly asked that very important question, and it is actually extended. If you look at so gender studies as such has extended our tendency to get trapped in the earlier gender binaries of male and female, which were determined by heteronormativity, and which we endlessly talked about in women's studies and women's history. So it is sort of broadened out to become what we now know as gender studies, which is perhaps more inclusive because it includes the sexuality spectrum of men, masculinities, apart from women and women and femininity, also men and masculinities and alternate sexualities as well. So this is a much broader area encompassing questions like, from a varied academic, many academic perspectives, varied academic perspectives, including many disciplines. It is that is why we call it an interdisciplinary area. So interdisciplinary approach, which incorporates, research from anthropology, history, language, literature, politics, psychology, rhetoric, writing, public discourse, sociology, visual culture, and among others. Though the focus is on gender, through a focus on gender identity and sexuality and gendered representation as central, they are the central categories of analysis. Gendered representations, whether it is male, female, or alternate sexualities. So gendered categories of analysis are interrogated. So gender studies actually, it is not looking at just an individuated woman's experience or man's experience, etc., etc. It looks at the whole spectrum or the complexity of human experience, which is male, female, and other, which includes male, female, and other. Although one would say that the argumentations are inspired or fundamentally rooted in what is being put forth advanced by feminism, the arguments are fundamentally of course, definitely arguments are being borrowed from feminism, feminist epistemology as such. We don't know, it is still debated. And gender studies courses take on a broad variety of theoretical approaches, about women's studies, men's studies, gay studies, lesbian, bisexual, transgender studies, etc. So we can't, because it is intersectional, we can't talk about, we can't keep away entanglements of knowledge, power, privilege, exclusion, race, caste, class, community, etc. And the dynamics of influence and how these they interact dynamically. What are the dynamics of interaction? How does the influence of this dynamics extend to other, our daily lives, etc., etc., and how they codify or configure our experiences of gender and sexuality on both a personal level and a broader social scale. So definitely, this is a very productive area, very vibrant area, and because it moves away from the academia as well, and it also, like the feminist epistemology, it also sort of gained traction for the authenticity of subjective experiences as well. Subjective experiences were not discredited; they were also they are still considered as valuable tools for research and knowledge. So the early concerns and early tools of women's studies approach are also incorporated into the gender studies research methodology. So this is important, and it extends beyond the academia because it touches our daily lived social and political experiences as well. So any any explanation of gender, definitely Buddha's take, or women's studies classes, for instance, when we talk about women's studies or gender, always we begin with the individual. What is the difference between sex versus gender? Sex as the biological makeup, a biological sex, as well as gender, which is a social construction which is based on sex. So we need to understand, for the students, we need to understand the difference between sex and gender. Because if you're talking about male, if you're talking about biological sex, it would be rather, it would be better to use male or female. Whereas if you're talking about sex mandated social role or behavior mandated by your behavior, or social behavior mandated by social role, or social behavior mandated by or structured by your sex, then definitely it would be preferable to use woman or man. So biologically we would use, when we are using it in the sense of biology or biological sex, we would prefer to use the terms male and female. Whereas it is behavioral or social, then definitely it would be preferable to use woman or man. So that is the basic difference between sex versus gender, which is there, which is which is an important component in women's studies as well as gender studies. So when we are talking about gender-oriented history, definitely the trigger or the inspiration came from the energy and the excitement which was generated by the feminist movement. And because the feminist movement reclaimed women's voices, women's experiences, and also advanced subjectivity is authentic history or authentic experience, authentic voice, authentic representation. So and also we're able to identify where are the silences, where are misrepresentations, erasures in women's historical past, erasure of women as historical actors in many places, periods and cultures. So women were not considered, women's histories were not counted, they were never part of history, and as we always say, history. So they were never part of history, but and their roles were erased, and they were never considered as historically important actors. So in this is true of all androcentric cultures, where experiences of men are generalized as the objective truth. So generally, many of you would know that I was the translator of Manushan Ramagam. So a lot of people ask me why I translated Manushan as man. Manushan as man. I have translated it as Manushan Ramagam was translated as a professed man. So a lot of people question me why I used man. But I think it is fundamentally a man's story, and it is not a generic term. Manushan is not a generic term in that particular story, because it is about a man's story. So it can only be a man. So it is man is the use of man and male-centric nouns and pronouns and language, anything for that matter, or experience for that matter. The experiences of men were generalized as objective truth. In psychoanalytic terms, we would use phallocentrism and phallocentric, etc., to draw attention to the phallus, which is the symbolic representation of male-centeredness. And from that, we have Derrida and Lacan drawing their theories of phallogocentrism, because ideas are centered, phallocentric ideas are centered around language or words or logos that are masculine in style. The post-structuralist feminist writers like Thrissur argue that phallogocentric language is the one which rationalizes, which organizes, compartmentalizes experiences, and the ism itself, they challenge the words ending with ism, feminism for that matter, which they say should be rejected because it is a phallogocentric language. And when we talk about gender history, is not about having an independent history for women, but it is, as Albusta points out, the female part of humanities was ignored for a long time, but it is as complex as man's, but do not follow the same kind of logic, linear, cohesive logic. So we need to alter the criteria probably, and we also need to alter the hierarchical importance or or unimportance, rather non-importance of the binaries that we are used to. So the gender studies and gender history is probably trying to be more inclusive, so that these kind of the accepted binaries, traditional binaries, would no longer be the only valid categories. Because gender historians have actually, interested in how gender difference has been perceived, and it is changing. If you look at the evolution of gender roles, etc., we would see that over time, over the period of time, it is definitely over centuries, over decades, and probably the changes are more rapid now. So gender differences are constantly being configured. The perceptions are changing as well. From in different times and places, the perceptions are changing. They are constantly being reconfigured, and the social constructs are changing. So, like when I was thinking about what to speak for this presentation, I was thinking we are not in a gender studies perspective at all. We are still debating the foundational categories or foundational debates of feminism even now. We haven't even got over that. So any woman academic, or any academic for that matter, who addresses the teaching community, for instance, would know that how difficult it is to talk about gender. We have umpteen gender sensitization courses and gender studies courses, but when we go for the courses and what happens to the activations, you yourself would have seen if it is a female academic, what happens to the kind of resistance that she has to face in the class. It doesn't matter whether she is good in the given topic or not. She fights a different battle, or altogether different battle. So the slow evolution, the reconfigurations, our perceptions about gender are constantly changing. There are constant reconfigurations, slow perhaps, but definitely reconfigurations are happening. And the slow evolution, it is a very slow evolution, which is, contests the pervasive androcentric normalizations. Normally we the way in which gender normalizations, especially heterosexual normalizations, and also any masculinist perception would be normalized through everyday discourses permeated by proverbs, sexist commonsensical sayings. Malayalamil eppoഴും നമ്മൾ പറയുന്നല്ലേ, തുമ്പെട്ടാൽ ഇന്ദ്രനും തടുക്കൂല, ചന്ദ്രനും തടുക്കൂല, ഇലമുള്ളിൽ വീണാലും. പിന്നെ നമ്മൾ സാധാരണ വളരെ ലോക്കലായിട്ട് പറയുന്നതാണ്, സ്ഥലങ്ങളും പറയുന്നത് എനിക്കറിയില്ല, 2 തല വാണാലും 4 മുല ഒക്കില്ല, അല്ലെ 2 തല ഒത്താലും 4 മുല ഒക്കില്ല. പുത്തനച്ചി പുരപ്പുറം any number of examples. പുത്തനച്ചി പുരപ്പുറം തൂക്കും, പുത്തനച്ചി തൂക്കുന്നതേ ഭാഗ്യം എന്ന് വിചാരിക്കുകയാണ്, എന്നാലും പുത്തനച്ചി പുരപ്പുറം തൂക്കുന്നുള്ളതാണ് അവിടെ ഉള്ള ഒരു accusation. Then we also have, umpteen the countless pearls of wisdom that we get from literature and cultural texts. We only need to look at Malayalam cultural texts and the masculinist novels, all novels for that matter, most of the novels in fact. And we understand as what we understand as normative or norms is legitimized through these proverbs and commonsensical sayings and the everyday use of language and cultural, all kinds of cultural discourses that we see and we encounter, and they set the expected norms of behavior for those who are labeled male or female. We never gave consideration to the others. We had all kind of skewered representations, like Dilip representing what is that movie, Dilip's movie,
Chandupatto.
ചാന്തുപൊട്ട്, പിന്നെ ഇപ്പൊ ജയസൂര്യയുടെ ട്രാൻസ്ജെൻഡർ മൂവി. അവർക്ക് അവരെ വോയിസസ് ഉണ്ടാവില്ല, അവർക്ക് പ്രസന്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ കഴിയില്ല. എപ്പോഴും നമ്മൾ സിസിന്റെ വോയിസ് മാത്രമേ പറ്റുള്ളൂ, നമ്മളെ റെപ്രസെന്റേഷൻ മാത്രമേ പറ്റൂ. So what is normated, or what is seen as norm or normative would be legitimized by language and language of everyday language and cultural discourses as well. So gender historians actually look at the changing norms and performances, the slow evolution of the configurations and reconfigurations. They study how these are evolving through time and interpret the changes to talk about larger social, cultural and political climate. Sebastian Sir was saying, I listened to the first one. So Sebastian Sir was saying in his talk on the 19th, he was talking about many structures of everyday life, our mental patterns, our social habits, our familial structures, etc., that work behind gender constructions and perceptions. Of course, we've been talking about public and private lives and how Kerala has been, able to keep away the private from any infiltration of the public enlightened ideas or progressive ideas, and we have always kept the private world as a sacrosanct world. അപ്പൊ നമ്മൾ ഒരിക്കലും ഒരുപാട് ആൾക്കാർ പറഞ്ഞതാണ്, ഒരു പ്രോഗ്രസീവ്നെസിന്റെ ധൂളി പോലും അകത്ത് കടത്താതെയാണ് നമ്മളുടെ ഫാമിലിയൽ സ്ട്രക്ചേഴ്സ് കൊണ്ടുപോയത്. And the first change, perhaps the first interrogation, came in terms of in the use of language, which came in the 80s and 90s. Gender sensitive aanam, gender savvy aanam, gender parity aanam, language lingilum aanam, otherwise we have to make it as gender sensitive as possible. It became commonplace. It became a commonplace concern in the 80s and 90s in the West. And in Malayalam also we are slowly transitioning, of course. Malayalam പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് മാറാൻ വലിയ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടായിരിക്കും. കാരണം തെറിവാക്കുകളിൽ എടുക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അത് സവർണത കൊണ്ടും ക്ലാസ് കൊണ്ടും ഇമ്പാക്ട് ചെയ്യപ്പെട്ടതായതുകൊണ്ട് നമുക്ക് മാറുകയില്ലല്ലോ. നമ്മൾ അച്ചിചരിത്രത്തിലൊക്കെ മുങ്ങിക്കിടക്കുന്നത് കൊണ്ട് നമുക്ക് ഇപ്പോഴും ഫെമിനിറ്റി ഒക്കെ ഉണ്ട്. സുന്ദരമായിട്ട് ലാംഗ്വേജുകളെ ബ്ലെൻഡ് ചെയ്യും നമ്മൾ, ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് ബ്ലെൻഡുകളാണ് ഇപ്പം. Because we are bilingual people fundamentally. Okay, so the feminists of the 80s and 90s objected to mankind and men being widely used in a generic way instead of a more gender neutral term like humankind or people. Rather than mankind and men, we would have they preferred gender neutral terms like humankind or people. The pronoun he, which is routinely used to talk about he and she, and also that was also seen as a problematic area, because the generic use of masculine nouns and pronouns sort of established or through linguistic practice, they established the status or reconfigured or reinscribed the status of women in general. And the language both reflect and contribute to the marginalization of women. So language became a key area. Gender sensitization of language became a key area. In academia, for instance, often male standpoint, or what we call the male epistemological standpoint, was seen as a norm, because even when there were male-centric research or research focused on men would be applied to women's questions as well. It would be generalized to what constitutes women's experience as well. So many stories, like say for instance, that's why later we started adding other areas of adding women to sort of the already pre-existing fields of inquiry, and we have women and studies about women and paid work, women artists, women film editors, for example. So we began to apply those categories to analyze women's experiences as well. And we began to reclaim, that was a very important area. We began to reclaim the voices which were not heard for a long time, the voices which were erased, or voices which were not heard at all. ഇപ്പൊ ദേവിക റീസെന്റ് സരസ്വതിയുടെ കഥകൾ ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. എത്രയോ എടുത്തു നോക്കാണ്, കേരളത്തിൽ എത്രയോ എടുത്തു നോക്കാണ്. ഒരു രാജലക്ഷ്മിക്ക് മരിക്കാനേ വിധിയുള്ളൂ. പത്മിനി ന്യൂഡുകൾ, അകത്തളങ്ങളിലെ ന്യൂഡുകൾ വരയ്ക്കുക. അത് I was talking to somebody, a friend of mine, and who said that there was, I don't know how many of you may know about it, there was a painter called Savitri, who exhibited her nude paintings sometime back in the 90s, early 90s, apparently early 90s or late 80s. അതിനുശേഷം തൃശ്ശൂരിലായിരുന്നു അത്ര എക്സിബിഷൻ നടത്തിയിരുന്നത്. അത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് അവരെ പിന്നെ ഒരിക്കലും കണ്ടിട്ടേയില്ല. അവരത്ര നാട് കടത്തപ്പെട്ടതുപോലെ പിന്നെ അവരൊരിക്കലും ഒരു പൊതുവേദികളിലോ ഒരു പൊതു സ്ഥലത്തോ അവരെ മെൻഷൻ ചെയ്തിട്ട് പോലുമില്ല. So that is the kind of gender biases that all these women writers and artists had to encounter. So we are slowly in the process of reclaiming women's voices, or we are correcting misrepresentations which have been done, finding erasures, silences, gaps, etc., etc. So, when we talk about the male epistemological stance, for instance, I'm quoting Carol Gilligan, who came out with a study about, psychological theories, how the psychological theories of development always repeatedly excludes women from theory building psychological studies, because they adopt the male life as the norm, male experience and male life as the norm. So psychological theories are exclusionist in practice, because they don't look at the women's experience. They look at they only consider the male experience. So male epistemological point of view. So she said that she argues that the androcentrism is embedded in psychological research, and that is why there is a disparity between academic theories and human development and experiences of women. So the disparity is caused by the point of view of the research itself. And, in the 80s, because women gained a lot of traction in, a lot more of traction in the public arena, began to gain a lot of visibility, and also women's voices were heard. And in employment also, there was, questions about, debates about parity in economic status, in salaries, etc., etc. So in the 1990s, because there was a widespread, with the rise of the right movement or right political formations, there was definitely a backlash, the backlash that Susan Faludi talks about. And it was also based on this idea that she bases the argument that there was a backlash against feminism in the 90s, primarily because there was rampant negative stereotyping of career women in the media. നമ്മുടെ മലയാളത്തിൽ അങ്ങനെയല്ലേ, വേഗം പെണ്ണ് ഒരുമ്പെട്ട പെണ്ണാണെങ്കിൽ അടിച്ച് മുഖത്തൊരു അടി കൊടുത്ത് ശരിയാക്കി എടുക്കും. അപ്പോ ഷേക്സ്പിയറിന്റെ കാലത്തേ ഉള്ളതാണ് ടൈമിംഗ് ഓഫ് ദ ഷ്രൂ എന്നുള്ളത്. മലയാള സിനിമയിൽ എത്തി നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ഒരു അടി കൊടുത്ത് ടൈമിംഗ് ഓഫ് ദ ഷ്രൂ ആക്കും. ടൈമിംഗ് ഓഫ് ദ എംപ്ലോയിഡ് വുമൻ, ടൈമിംഗ് ഓഫ് ദ അസർട്ടീവ് വുമൻ, ആൻഡ് ടൈമിംഗ് ഓഫ് ദ woman who asserts herself, her position. It involved a backlash, involved resisting of the traction which women had gained in the workplace and the visibility that they gained in the public arena. And there was also, and perhaps that was also responsible for broadening the area of gender studies, because there were a lot of studies happening in the diversity, questioning this idea. Masculinity studies were emerging, and they were questioning this idea of a homogeneous, unitary androcentric culture, a homogeneous idea of masculinity. And of course, there was Menonism, etc., beginning of Menonism, etc. And they argued that there are no single homogeneous man's experience, which could be, like how it was in the case of women as well. It was also about varied masculinities, different kinds of masculinities, diversity of men's status and position in society. Feminism in the 90s was looked at with a deep suspicion, and also other areas about other studies about sexualities were coming to the forefront, and naturally, it had to broaden into. Naturally, there was the need to broaden the studies into gender studies, which was supposed to be, which is hoped to be, more inclusive and broader in its focus. And then so it was able to, in many ways, it was able to counter this negative stereotyping, and also counter the backlash which was quite rampant in America, for instance. And because all over there was this revival of the old nostalgia about how things were wonderful. So good old day nostalgia, and cancelling the gains that women, which tried to cancel the gains that women had made in media, law, academia, employment. Even now, it is not different. Every day, it is an ongoing struggle. So what does gender studies entail, and gender history as well entail? What does it entail? What do they entail? It obviously came from women's studies, and the women's critique of patriarchy holds for both women's studies as well as gender studies, because we live in a stratified society. Society is stratified by patriarchal power, privileged, definitely privileged by gender, and privileged by, when it comes to alternate sexualities, it is privileged by the gender itself, is privileged by heteronormative perceptions. So it involves revision. What does it bring forth? It brings revisions about traditional historiography that had underrepresented, misrepresented, or not at all represented anything, erased the histories of men, which were nowhere to be seen in the general, universal, actual, legitimate, serious mainstream history. Serious, mainstream, legitimate, actual, universal history did not have a space for women. So women's studies entered the discipline and started questioning, reclaiming history for the cultural history of women, and traditional historiography also began to incorporate the gender. Historiography also began to change, incorporating the gender equation into its perspective. So it began to question gaps, silences, and the misrepresentations and erasure of women's participation in the historical process. And so it can't be otherwise, because the society is ordered by men, and it is ordered by patriarchal men, and obviously it is a history. And in the 80s and 90s, we had a series of historians taking stock of why women's histories were not written, and if at all it was written, what happened to them, and were they erased, were they lost, were they shunted out of public view. And it stirred debates about the implications of such exclusions in historiography, and inquiries also, and it also stirred inquiries as to how to chart a history, not an independent history of the various sections, but an interlinked history which offers an equitable place for both men and women. GH would be, as somebody put it, GH would be restoring women, not restoring women to it would be restoring women to history, and began with restoring women to history, but it has evolved into restoring history to women, because women are claiming their due in history. It actually brings, gender history actually brings gender relations to the center of history, and in turn brings a sense of gender to the history of gender studies. So it's a sort of a reciprocal relationship, and we can't, put them in watertight compartments, because these are all interdisciplinary, intersecting histories, intersecting studies as well as histories. So when we talk, from the beginning, from the earliest discourses, we know how women have been put in their places in the most popular narrative of Nal, and I quoted that because despite all the indignities that Damayanti had to fight, ultimately when she finally finds, after all the travails that she had to undergo, and finally she reaches, when he abandons her in the forest, and finally she reaches home, her father's home, and she initiates a search party for finding about Nalan and to bring back her husband. And the first, the husband should have come back chastened, but unfortunately, the thing that he has to tell her is that Tarunina manasil mevum kudilangalararivu. So who can, guess the kind of, I have to make a translation. Anyway, we abandon it. I can't make a quick translation of that. So anyway, what are the kind of things that we can do? What is gender studies? What is it opened up? Gender and history, of course, gender and history. I'm talking about gender studies and history together because both of them are interlinked as well. And I'm not a historian, so I'm not looking at it from a purely historical point of view at all. So historical social relations are interrelated, as we said earlier. Historical social relations in gender history interrogates historical social relations from a feminist feminine perspective, and also gender. Now, when we move to gender studies, gender perspective, gender perspective, and we're looking at gender-specific characteristics of all social institutions. So, men, not only women and femininity, men and masculinity, and social relations founded on all power relations based on various kinds of sexuality. Also, the alternate sexualities, the whole spectrum of alternate sexualities also form an important, also form the crux of gender studies. And then gender is definitely, gender studies is more inclusive because it is not just about men and women, but it is layered and imbricated, especially in India. They're layered and imbricated with other categories and factors like race, caste, religion, ethnicity, etc. And how gender has been historically constructed. And the practice of gender studies and gender history definitely will cut across disciplines, and that is why we call them interdisciplinary. This is only for the students, as gender studies implicates not only history, literature, culture, anthropology, sociology, economics, and whatnot. So it influences, it influences cognitive, our gender ideas or our gender perceptions influence cognitive development, and even structure epistemology, structure knowledge, the way we think, the way we speak, how we understand femininity, how we understand feminine roles, how we understand masculine roles, masculine identities, sexual orientations, social roles, images, institutions, belief systems, etc. We are constantly, perhaps because of gender, women's studies and gender studies, these are all constructs which are constantly undergoing negotiations and reconfigurations. Hopefully, it has definitely broadened the scope of women's studies because it has moved from just women's sexuality and women's, experiences, and moved on to be more inclusive. Okay, so I'd like to, that's why I said I'm looking at examples right from our back or around me, because we are constantly living with the gender polemics. If you look at gender polemics in Kerala, we are in the thick of it, because with the same, as I mentioned earlier, in passing I mentioned earlier about the smuggling case, gold smuggling case, and again we're coming back to the same valorization of male points of view, and how men can escape being indicated in the criminal racket, whereas a woman's role will be highlighted because she is, of course, the tuna, the abyss of a misogyny let us call her the tuna fish. We once, it is only quite recently that somebody, it is not very far away when we had this same polemics which were debated some time ago. And Pidakkunna tuna malsyam, the culture, the depraved misogyny that we live with is again manifesting in the discussions, the media discussions that we have on a daily basis. And also I'd also like to point out, when we were asking we were taking the feedback from all of you, must be undergoing that as well. So feedback from the online education and access, we're transitioning to online education, online classes, and even there, even technology is not free from the gender biases. It seems to be like that because our students tell us that if there are 3 children at home and one is the boy would often get a preference because the boy would often be in some professional education, and if he is involved in professional education, he is a student of some professional education or professional course, definitely he would have a better access, or he would have more access to the available devices. I don't know how far it is true for all of you, but this is what our students say. So even technology is not free from our gender biases. And in fact, I was reading about, as a translator, I was reading about Turkish language and the gender neutrality. Turkish language is a gender neutral language with no he and she, but o. But when Google, I was reading about it, a translator's quandary, because she says every time I write engineer, Google would automatically translate it as he. The pronoun would be a he. Every time she talks about a nurse, the pronoun automatically would be a she, because it depends on the number of repetitions, a higher frequency of appearance of male engineers and female nurses. So even the inequalities and our biases and inequalities are underwritten. The culturally constructed biases and inequalities are underwritten even into our technology, because the algorithms, in fact, mirror our sexist tendencies of language. Because we are the ones who are shaping technology, and automatically our biases will be there in technology as well. And when we're talking about our students as well, they were talking about social and geographical location that determines access as well, not only gender, but also social and geographical this thing. Anyway, that's a different matter. So social history the gender studies is opened up a wide area, research areas for social history of gender domestic, especially domestic structures based on gender domestic structures. And especially and I'm more worried about how the girls are, because I teach in a girls college, and I know they hated that they hate the fact that they are confined inside their houses. The college was their escape. So how an insidious, they are trapped in their domesticity, and this gender domestic structure comes with its own inequalities. And it definitely, we will not know more about it, because there is an insidious and unmentionable culture of silence when it comes to domestic issues, domestic violence, gender problems, etc. And whenever we can't talk about it, because it is there it is institutionalized. When there is an issue mentioned, everybody would like to sort of gloss over it, because it is always the boys club culture with the men's group who rally around when there is an issue, a gender related complaint or gender related issue to debate, even issues about access to technology. And it would always be, of course, I wouldn't free the women. I can't say that the women are not implicated. Women are not part of it. Women are also part of the boys club project, because they are the handmaidens of patriarchy, and they're also shaped by androcentric culture. And then we definitely, gender studies is going to be an area which is very important for us, because of this, especially because of the pandemic, and we're all confined inside. There is a lot of, we're all confined inside, and there is going to be a lot of economic fallout, definitely more so for women, because many of them are in the unorganized sector, and even Kudumbashri women, for instance, in the unorganized sector, who are rendered jobless, and they're going to face a great fall in their income. And there is going to be the issue of gendered economy and how it is going to affect women. And according to UN, I would end with this. According to UN study, recent report, many of you would have read about it. Violence against women has increased by 25% around the world in the current pandemic. And furthermore, now we have the lockdown looming over us, and the economy after that. When the economy recovers, definitely there would be a prolonged, I'm quoting, prolonged dip in women's incomes and labor force participation, because more epidemics and pandemics are predicted. And definitely the question of gender cannot be sidestepped here, because women constitute 70% of the global health. I'm quoting directly from the UN report. And workforce in sectors like nursing, midlife, cleaners, etc., they're going to face a high risk, and not also. It is going to be more of unpaid care work and invisible recognized domestic work, which is seminal to sustaining any society, which will all fall on women. Okay, so perhaps gender studies would help us, overcome the centuries of mistrust and misrepresentation of all sexuality, mistrust and misrepresentations, and hopefully we will move forward to, we would be able to explore, probably in the wake of this pandemic, probably we would be able to look at, actual gender situation and perhaps plan better for a gender equitable society in which we would have a lot more of cultural sensitivity to the varied genders and their needs and demands as well. So hopefully we will be able to free ourselves, men as well as women, and all sexuality, all the sexual spectrum, whole sexual spectrum would be able to move away from toxic configurations of gender. And probably we would be, there is a crisis facing masculinities of all kinds, and probably we would emerge into a better, more equitable, more inclusive understanding of gender. Thank you.
If there are any comments, please.
Good evening, ma'am. This is Annie Thomas. If you can hear me.
Yeah, I can.
It is a very nice talk. I would just like you to again talk about the role of cinema and TV serials in continuing misogyny in Kerala, especially. Because it's one of the reasons I don't like watching Malayalam films, and I feel it continues, and like you said, it's like the women themselves. So what is the role of TV? What can they do to change it?
How do I answer that question, because it is not in our control? But I think a lot more of research is, we've been talking about the invasive presence of the cultural discourses, all these misogynistic cultural discourses. Again and again, we've been talking about since the beginning of this century. And I'm sure that a lot more research and youngsters, social media has been interesting this to a large extent, and hopefully better dynamics, better understanding. With the better understanding, probably things will change. I think I'm hopeful things are changing. It will take a lot of time to change, but definitely there is no doubt that the cultural narratives are implicated in this role. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, ma'am. Absolutely, I should say it was absolutely a wonderful talk, and I'm so happy that you are from the same institution in which I am a postgraduate student. So,
really?
So my question is, yeah, really, ma'am. So I was just when you were doing the lecture, I was just thinking that there is so much of romantification, or this kind of the glorification of womanhood, or this kind of motherhood, which we always come across every day, right? Oh, it is the duty of a mother. A mother is supposed to be, so much of humble, pious. She has to suffer. She is supposed to, have the last bite of food, or I hope you understand the things like that.
I didn't catch the question as such, but I think you're talking about the internalizations, which are quite rampant, and I'm sure that we ourselves are, guilty of it. Often we ourselves, or each one of us, in fact, that's why I mentioned at the beginning that we had a wonderful session, and that's how I met Manoj sir and Lukman sir. So we were all talking about internalizations which are there in each one of us. I wouldn't say I may be progressively, I may be becoming a bit more gender sensitive, but there are so many things that we have to change on an everyday basis. So obviously we are constantly contesting, constantly challenging, constantly reconfiguring, and this is against the cultural discourses and language which are constantly telling us, constantly putting us in our place. So obviously somebody was asking me about historical romances. Historical romances, obviously the cultural narratives are responsible for fixing the role of women. Fixing the role of women in, as I said earlier, taming of the shrew. The title itself is about two men joining together to put the assertive woman in place. Taming of the shrew is a metaphor which has been there right from, it's a strain which has been right from there, right from the beginning. So obviously it is our roles are internalized, whether it is masculine roles or women's roles, and all the cultural narratives are implicated in that. Films, TV, serials, historical romances, all kinds of romances.
Ma'am, I have a doubt. Ma'am, you spoke about the masculinity topic. So I would ask you, how has the hyper-masculinity displayed in presidential politics?
In presidential politics, hypermasculinity has been there. It has been an important category from the 90s itself, and that's why I said. That's why while I was talking about the backlash, the Susan Faludi's book, Backlash, she's also talking about how there is a rampant negative stereotyping of women, and also the valorization of the toxic masculinity and hyper masculinity identities, which of course we have in all the far right, and it is also coextensive with the rise of far right movement, far right political formations and predilections in the 90s, and it continues even now for us as well as in America. We don't have to mention, of course, the if you look at the political scenario, it's all about hyper masculinity, hyper nationalism. It is all about hyper toxic masculinist categories, which are valorized.